Thank you very much. I have a habit of wandering around quite a lot, and I'll probably at some point drop this and make a fool of myself. I'm also not known for hiding my political and social beliefs, so there may be some polemic conversations going on through my talk, but I do not apologise for that at all. So I'm just going to briefly mention my research interests and how I got to this point of talking about resilience, really. And then I'm going to talk about resilience and the concept quite briefly, because it's probably quite well known about, and I want to focus on the ways in which some of those conversations are being taken into directions that I find deeply problematic, particularly looking at grit, mindset and character education, which I'm going to be quite critical of. Then I'm going to focus on some of my research around resilience and the ways in which I've been working to understand how students who are in themselves people of resilience still end up dropping out early from higher education, what might be going on there. And then Julian asked me to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done around mattering and understanding how students think about who matters in higher education. And in that bit I'm going to focus specifically on working with refugees, because that's a very strong, long-standing thread of my research. So I've been researching and working with refugees for about the last 10 years, and I'm just in the process of setting up a mentoring scheme at Sheffield Hallam, which I'm hoping will eventually work in collaboration with Sheffield University to support refugees. So it's going to be quite wide range, and there's quite a lot in here. I will try and finish in about 50 minutes, but actually my habit is to try and talk for long enough so there's no time for questions, so you can't ask me anything whatsoever, so who knows. And then I'm going to come up with some ways that I think it would be helpful to try and take some of this thinking forward to avoid the quite deficit ways in which we frame students if we're not careful. You can interrupt at any point. I'm quite happy to take questions. I'm happy to be challenged. I don't believe I'm right. I'm just talking about my perception, my research, so if you want to interrupt me at any point, feel free to do so. That's absolutely fine. I'm going to stand here, otherwise my temptation will be to do that. So resilience, it's a concept that I suppose in some ways it's quite self-explanatory. We use the concept all the time when we're talking about people who we talk about as being resilient. We think we have that sense of what it means. In actuality, it's quite a contested term, and it's got quite a history in terms of the ways it's been thought about and used, particularly in sociology. In short, resilient people are those who have better outcomes than would have been expected, dependent on the circumstances they've been through. So they make good adaptations despite going through risky or stressful experiences. So there's something there in the ways in which people who are resilient make a positive adaptation, and to get to that point they draw on internal resources, which I'll come back to in a moment, but also what's happening externally and the support that's available to them. And people who are resilient, the literature would argue that the more resilient you are, the more you're able to demonstrate resilience in new circumstances. So somebody who survives trauma in their childhood would tend to be, hypothetically, able to survive traumatic experiences later in life. I think there's an issue here, because one of my arguments is the people that I research with have shown extraordinary resilience and don't necessarily stay resilient in higher education. So there's something going on that I wish to problematise there. So it matters, resilience matters, and there's a whole body of literature here that I'm not going to go into in great detail, because we do know that people who are able to demonstrate resilience and survive trauma and stressful circumstances are less likely to get involved in things like offending behaviours, drug and alcohol misuse and so on. And we know that people who are resilient also tend to have more positive mental health than other people. And the work that's been done looking at people who've being particularly resilient through stressful circumstances in the army show that they're less likely to have post-traumatic stress, etc., etc. And there's also some, but not as much, work around resilience in terms of employment, and then more recently in terms of education, that shows that people who are resilient are more likely to achieve in those particular circumstances. However, a caveat, if you look at that body of literature, it's not very robust. So there's a lot of there's a lot of work, but the actual empirical evidence base for some of the claims that are made about resilience are a little bit problematic. And I think there's quite a lot of overclaiming, I would argue, particularly in the American literature, that needs to be challenged and interrogated. So, if we're thinking generically about how we enhance people's resilience, first of all, you will not demonstrate resilience unless you are in a circumstance that's particularly stressful or risky. But of course, everybody's idea of what is risky or stressful is different. So you may find that an individual finds Freshers' Week stressful or risky, whereas somebody else might sail all the way through it. So the context is very, very different. So you can't anticipate who may or may not find those particular circumstances risky. Conditions of adversity are very, very much localised and context specific. This is where I start to get a little bit troubled by some of the literature when we're talking about who's most vulnerable to not survive particularly well in those circumstances. And a lot of the early work that's been done, the research that's been done, suggests that there's something quite deficit in terms of people's character and disposition if they're unable to survive circumstances where somebody else survives quite happily. So there's something about the ways in which, right from the early days of the resilience literature, the issue has been located within the individual to not have the right sort of disposition or personality to enable them to survive. And I'll come back to that in a little bit as well. And so when that person is exposed to negative circumstances, they will not do particularly well, whereas somebody else would do. And a lot of that early work, as I say, would locate the reasons for that in the sort of disposition and character of the individual. There are also obviously protective circumstances that are outside of us as individuals, so family, the society we live in, the access we have to different sorts of services and so on. So all resilience literature will look at internal and external factors, but they might locate the emphasis in one way or another. So the psychological literature around resilience has tended to look more internally. The sociological literature will tend to look more externally. The research that's been done looking at whether resilient people are resilient people are resilient people, and whether it's a global phenomenon or a global situation, shows that there are local factors that can be applied across all communities, but they are locally specific. So issues, for example, of family support is a global local factor that might shape whether somebody is able to survive in a particular situation of adversity, but what that family circumstance would be very different to a middle class student living in Sheffield to somebody living in poverty in Afghanistan, for example. But it would be the same thing about having that family support. So in terms of internal resources and characteristics, this is split into two different areas. And first of all, there's the argument that resilient people are people who demonstrate particular traits of optimism, creativity, sense of humour and so on. You're more likely to be resilient as well if you have a particular belief system, so if you're religious or you have any other form of belief. If you have a cohesive life narrative, so you have a strong sense of where you're moving through life. So if you have a sense that you are part of an ongoing project to get to somewhere where you want to be, and that you can see and start to understand how you can get into that future. So you need to have a concrete view of that future and to be able to think that that future is possible. And alongside of that, resilient people, according to the literature, have a wide range of competencies which include the things that I've listed here. So coping strategies, social skills, educational abilities and so on. Memory above the average rules me out. Social competence, perhaps ditto, etc. The literature does divide into children who are resilient and the work that's been done with children, adolescents and adults. And my particular interest is in post-18-year-olds. So I have tended to look more at the literature around adult resilience. It's very similar, but there is more around issues of determination tends to crop up more in the adult literature, although there's been much less written about adults and resilience than there has been about adolescents and young people, particularly in terms of education, not necessarily in other areas. So all of this is very logical. So going back to what I talked about in terms of external factors that surround the person who is able to be resilient, family comes up more than anything else. So those people who are surrounded by at least one person for whom they have a strong sense of kinship are more likely to survive well in conditions of adversity. Belief system I've talked about. When it's young people, it's about positive parent and child interactions, and you can see all the list down here, and it's unsurprising that income and financial security comes quite high on this list as well. Stable residence, so these things are pretty logical really. Routines and rituals are in there as well, and mattering is one of the things that I would argue needs to be added to this list, that you feel that you matter to those around you, and that's what I'm going to come back to a bit later on in the talk. Can you hear me? Because I know that this isn't, yeah, is that all right? Okay, so apart from family then, community is really important, and the things around community in a way reflect what's said about family, but sort of more extended. So involvement in activities, peer acceptance, particularly for children, but I'll come back to that in terms of adults in higher education as well. Networks, mentors, and then feelings of safety and actual safety, and then access to healthcare, financial support, and so on. So the literature is pretty consistent for both family and community external factors. But what's happened with the more recent literature is that there has been this shift from the psychological to the sociological. And so whereas the earlier literature around resilience was really very much located in the sort of psychological discourse of the inner resources that somebody might have or not have, now and that meant that the individual was the locus of change. There's been work that's been done more recently which is actually saying that we need to think about this much more sociologically, and rather than seeing resilience as a personality trait, we need to look at those external factors that I've talked about there and really recognise the importance of the external world to the individual. Also, rather than the idea that resilience, if you're resilient in one domain, you will necessarily be resilient in another, has been challenged in the more recent literature. So that can evolve over time, and now there is a recognition that just because you were maybe a resilient child does not mean that you will be resilient regardless of what life throws at you. It is context and time specific, although there are still those universal traits that I've talked about. And really some of the more recent research has come together to say that it's sort of the psychological, the dispositional, the biological is quite contested, and then the sociological, the social support, and you need to have both of those things. So you can't think about resilience just in terms of those deficit framings of individuals as lacking a particular set of dispositions, which means why they don't do very well in particular circumstances. Now this for me is really important. I struggle with most things that locate problems in individuals, and I've always worked thinking more sociologically. So I'm very happy to get to this point. Final slide on sort of this ecological consideration of resilience. The final thing that I really am interested in thinking about is the interventions that enable people to survive adversity and come out of the other end being a resilient person. So it's about the intervention. So rather than the locus of change being the individual and what they're doing, the locus of change here is the intervention and how it can actually shape the world for an individual. And so the intervention interacts with risk factors to support and help those most at risk. And this is where I come back to the argument about why I'm troubled with what's happening in the ways in which we're thinking about resilience, because it starts to move away from this point that we've got to with an ecological understanding.